Good afternoon, and welcome to the Security Studies Program panel on, I guess we'll call it religious intolerance across South Asia. I'm going to be really brief in the interest of time in terms of introducing the speakers. Professor Dina Siddiqui, she is a clinical associate professor at NYU's School of Liberal Studies. Professor Neil Devoda, he is a professor of politics and international affairs at Wake Forest University. Professor Bidisha Biswas is a professor of political science at Western Washington University. And Dr. Mohammed Taki, an old friend of mine, he is, I don't know how to describe him. He is a man about everything. He's going to be talking specifically about Pakistan. He's a medical doctor by training, but don't let that qualification fool you. He knows a lot about a lot of things. So with those brief introductions, you can obviously Google folks to find their personal homepages or their institutional homepages. We're actually going to start beginning with Sri Lanka and Professor Neil Devoda. I think this is a country where, if you've been paying attention to South Asia or Sri Lanka in particular, the rising trend of Buddhist intolerance towards Christians and Muslims wouldn't be a surprise, but for a lot of people, the idea of violent Buddhists and violent Buddhist monks might seem kind of odd at first blush. So we're going to start with Neil Devoda, and then we're going to turn to Professor Dina Siddiqui. Then we'll turn to Professor Bidisha Biswas, and then to Dr. Mohammed Taki. So Neil, 10, 15 minutes, take it away.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's very good to be a part of this group. As many of you know, there's been this what's called an Aragalaya, or a struggle in Sri Lanka, which actually commemorates a year this month in March. It began last March. And this was an attempt to get rid of the government. It did succeed in getting rid of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the president, and his brother, the Prime Minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa. And this attempt brought together people from across the ethnic divide. It brought together Buddhists and Christians and Muslims, and also from the class divide. And so there was this narrative that was constructed, which was a legitimate narrative that, here were Sri Lankans coming together, irrespective of all the ethno-religious tensions that had undermined Sri Lankan society since basically independence, especially since about the mid-1950s. And but this was a struggle against the government based on the scarcity of essential goods, and to misread this as a coming together of ethnic groups was I think improper, and I tried to make that in some of these forums, and it didn't sit very well with some people. And so what we've seen as a result of the economic crisis is that some of the ethno-religious tensions have taken a backstage. So we don't see much tension right now because people are caught up with just living life, putting food on the table, especially among the poorer forces. But that being said, nationalism in Sri Lanka has been the bane of this small island. It's gone through nearly 30 years civil war. Even after the civil war, there was Islamophobia that was whipped up. So we saw anti-Muslim sentiment and violence against Muslims. And the nationalism that is at the forefront here is Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism. And it hasn't gone away. It is muted right now because of the situation the country finds itself in. And Chris started out by saying people are surprised when they find out that a Buddhist country can be a fairly violent society. If you go back and read some of the histories associated with Buddhism, and I'm not a historian, but one of the things you see is how divisive Buddhist societies were. Violence seems to have been quite common in even ancient times. And the only reason we think of Buddhist societies as peaceful is because I think we kind of envision the Dalai Lama or something like that when we talk about Buddhism and Buddhist societies. But if you take Burma, if you take even Thailand, and if you look at Sri Lanka, what you realize is that these societies can be just as violent as any other society. And there are, various cross-cutting cleavages that fan the extremism. And so and one of the things we don't want to do is blame the religion here, just like we don't want to blame the religion, say Islam, when it comes to Islamist extremism or Hinduism per se. What you have here is what a lot of us would call political Buddhism. It's the religion being manipulated by political forces, ethnic entrepreneurs, business entrepreneurs using religion in very destructive ways. And so while Sri Lanka has in some ways gone through 3 or 4 years of not seeing religious violence, there's just no saying when this can be whipped up for political gain. The description that was sent when I was asked to be a part of the panel talked about a rumor that led to violence against Hindus in Bangladesh, which then led to violence against Muslims in Tripura. And I was reminded of a rumor just before this, before COVID hit. And it was a rumor that spread in Sri Lanka right after the 2019 Easter Sunday bombings. And this was a rumor against a doctor that was highly respected and highly liked. It was the gynecologist. And the rumor was that this particular, and a Muslim doctor, and that this particular Muslim doctor was secretly sterilizing women. And this led to his being arrested and he's losing his job temporarily. I think he was without a salary and a job for about 3 years. He has since been reinstated, I believe. Around the same time, or just before this, there was another rumor, and that rumor was against a Muslim eatery, claiming that it was including a form of a pill disguised as flour within the vegetables and the rice and whatnot, which then was preventing the clients, mainly Buddhists, from conceiving. And again, this all had to do with procreation, right? I mean, this was an attempt on the part of the Muslims to keep the Buddhist population where it is, even though the Buddhist population is about 70% of the country, and the Sinhalese are about 75% of the population. So it's instructive how just a rumor with absolutely no evidence, no basis, just a silly rumor could get people all exercised and lead to violence. And as we know, those of us who study South Asia, oftentimes riots and pogroms are events that occur as a result of these sorts of rumors. One of the things I think I would try to mention here is that when we think of ethno-religious violence in South Asia, or for that matter in many other places, but especially in South Asia, this is not simply an issue that is fanned domestically. It's gotten more complicated, I think, and social media has especially made it more complicated. We have domestic ethno-religious tensions that lead to regional ethno-religious tensions. The Tamils in Sri Lanka affecting the politics of Tamil Nadu in India, or the Sikhs in the Punjab affecting the politics in the Pakistani Punjab. We have, and then there's also an international dimension because of the diaspora politics that we see. So this is true with the Tamils, but this is also true with the Sikhs, and we saw this recently with this attempt to vandalize or attack some of the consulates or embassies, Indian embassies. And so this is an issue now that resonates beyond just a country's domestic space. And social media, I think, has made this worse and will only make it more complicated going forward. So this new government in Sri Lanka, as a result of the package that it has worked out with the IMF, which was just kind of approved, but this is just the beginning of a very difficult process for the country because it still has to restructure debts, and that's going to take anywhere from 6 months to a year if they're lucky. But one of the things this new president tried to do was to try and implement what's called the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And the 13th Amendment to the Constitution has to do with the provinces, and this was something that was initiated by the Indians in the late 80s when the Indian peacekeeping force was stationed in Sri Lanka as part of the Indo-Lanka peace agreement. It seeks to empower the provinces, devolve power to the provincial authorities, and it's never really taken effect, especially when it comes to the Eastern province and the Northern province in Sri Lanka. And so this new president was trying to get this kind of going because I think he had made some promises to the Indians, and it's something the international community is very much in favor of. And the moment he broached the issue, there were the monks, and some of them could be branded extremist monks, but most of them are not one does not viscerally consider them extremists. Some of them are highly respected monks within society. They kind of came together across the different sects and said that there was absolutely no way that they were going to let this happen. And now this, by the way, is something that is in the Constitution. So it was not like they were trying to get something done that was not a part of the Constitution. So the country is at a stage where, and I think this reminded people that, again, the point I had made, in some of these forums, which did not go very well, because everybody wanted to look at the struggle that was taking place and try to make a pitch that Sri Lanka had kind of, crossed a bridge, that we were suddenly in a situation where people were coming together to try and craft a new constitution, to create a new society. And the argument I had made very briefly was that, we're not going to see the kind of constructive change that we need to see in this country until we move away from the country being an ethnocracy. And by ethnocracy, I mean a country dominated by a Sinhalese Buddhist majority community. Now you can see how that is not a sexy argument to make if your constituency is part of the majority community. And I also kind of said that I did not expect much to happen as a result of this uprising when everybody wanted a lot to happen. And I'm afraid that I have turned out to be, for the most part, right. And so, again, my point here would be that we have an issue that has been masked as a result of the economic difficulties the country has faced. And insofar as Sri Lanka is going to get away from majoritarianism, it would have to cease to be an ethnocracy. And I really have a hard time seeing how that's going to transpire. So let me leave it there, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
All right. Hey, thank you. That was really good. Next, we're going to turn to Professor Dina Siddiqui to talk about Bangladesh.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I'm going to agree a lot with what Neil has said about the basic framework of analyzing. And what I've done is put together a couple of slides, 5 slides, in which I try to pull in the frameworks through which I have understood majoritarianism and violence in Bangladesh. So let me start here. And I'm sorry if this sounds a little bit like a class lecture. Realize, very sorry. Okay, so I think majoritarianism is, as Neil pointed out very clearly, is intimately related to the making of nationalism, right? And we all know that all nationalisms have an exclusionary aspect. And we all, you know, nationalisms need an other, often an internal enemy. And often at moments of crisis, this nationalist self and othering is mobilized. And I want to talk about that in the context of Bangladesh and examples from Bangladesh. The first thing is that majoritarian violence, it's worth remembering, isn't just about religious, doesn't necessarily have to be about religious or ethnic violence, but it can work through other registers. It can manifest itself through secular registers like language and nationality. And we see that very clearly in Bangladesh. Again, the constitution, which has restored secularism, the word in there, we can also has institutionalized the idea of who is a true citizen of Bangladesh. A Bengali speaker is the true citizen, right? So who can be a full citizen, who truly belongs, and who is an outsider, and who is potentially treacherous or a threat to national purity, is already there in the law that is nominally secular, even though also Bangladesh still has Islam as a state language. Basically, I would say that Bangladesh is a Bengali Muslim majoritarian nation state. So it's both Bengali, and so there's a lot of what you might call Bengali majoritarianism at work, and you see that in relation particularly to the Hindu minority. But there are other ways. If you are not Bengali speaking, you don't belong to the nation. You don't have the same claims to the nation as you would if you are Bengali speaking, whether you're, as the famous poster goes, whether you're Buddha, Muslim, Christian, or Hindu, we are all Bengali, but you're always an outsider in that sense. Your claim to the nation is a different kind of claim. So that's the first thing. The other thing, I've just been thinking today about what kind of place Bangladesh is today, what kind of polity it is today in relation to violence. And I suppose we could also call it a majoritarian democracy, because there is technically democracy in Bangladesh. Majoritarianism and democracy are quite compatible. Of course, they're compatible if you look at India and Myanmar. They're very extreme, and I suppose increasingly Sri Lanka, extreme, but India and Myanmar are very extreme examples of majoritarianism and democracy at work. What you find in Bangladesh is a majoritarian democracy that's also extremely authoritarian. So I think we can't talk about what happens to minorities of whatever kind without talking about the larger authoritarian regime that is there, that works in the interest of various people. So it's not just nationalism. I want to add that if we really want to understand the dynamics of majoritarian violence in this democracy that is Bangladesh, we also need to keep in mind the kind of state we have, what the state is for and who it serves. And here, I think more broadly, I think we need to think about the political economy, the global and local political economy, material interests, capitalism, whatever you want to call it. And this is where, and if you look at, for instance, the Chittagong Hill Tracts and the inhabitants of the Chittagong Hill Tract and the kind of violence to which they are subjected, which is violence from the military, violence from Bengali settlers, violence against women who are not ethnically Bengali from the military and the settlers, then you can see it's the coming together. There's a mobilization of the rhetoric of, in the name of preserving the Bengali nation, you have also saving state and national interests, with actually the interests of capital being served. So you have plantations, you have dispossession and people making fancy hotels. Somebody is making a lot of money off of all of that's happening, but it is happening democratically and in a secular state, right? In the name of the nation. And nationalism, I think, as Neil was talking about, is such a troublesome thing, right? It can be deployed and mobilized in so many ways. Okay, the third thing is, again, I was reading the description of the little concept note that you sent, and I want to talk much more about the social media aspect, but it's also, as I was reading the description, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that there are no primordial, we know this, but there are no already existing historical divisions that then get exacerbated by colonial rule, at least in the way we think about political identity today. There might have been people who thought of themselves as Muslims, might have been people who were Bengali speakers, but there was no collective national identity. It's really important to remember that colonial technologies of rule, which have been taken up by post-colonial nation states and their bureaucracies, were a major contributing factor. And that includes census operations about how you count, who belongs. So the Rohingya weren't counted in this democratic 2014, whatever, census that went on. But the making of personal laws, the institution of separate electorates, all of which have been given new life in post-colonial states, produce coherent identities from essentially fuzzy, fluid, localized ones. They're seemingly coherent. And it is really important to remember that this Bengali Muslim dichotomy is a constructed dichotomy. If we want to unpack it, it is not that from time immemorial there were Bengalis and there were Muslims, and somehow I really am against this contradiction that nationalists talk about, partly because it depoliticizes. It's very dangerous as an explanatory framework because it erases the politics of mobilizing identities and the work that these identities do. So I think it's very hard to entangle religion from politics in that sense. And I remember I wrote an article a very long time ago, my first foray called when there was a lot of violence in 2001 against Hindus in particular, post elections, and the BNP won there. But my title was a question mark: communalizing the political or politicizing the communal. I think it's both things are happening, but there are these entanglements that are at multiple scales. And again, I think violence against Hindus in Bangladesh is a good example. At the local level, and we're talking primarily about poorer Hindus, right? Hindus are already disempowered by virtue of being Hindus in a country with Islam as the state religion, right? But I think a lot, if not most of the violence is also already all about land grabbing, often by paid goons who are affiliated with the national ruling party, whatever ruling party is in power, because both parties have been very much implicated in this. So at the national level, local people get protection for their violent acts, while there is a capitalist accumulation of land going on, right? But at the regional level and at the international level, again, there's something else going on, because you have to ask, why are ordinary citizens, ordinary Bengali Muslims, then also invested in believing the truth of certain kinds of rumors, right? Why would they believe that this social media rumors going around about the desecration of a Quran at the Durga Puja, which already, if you think about it, just sounds so wrong, But why do people believe? One is, there is something also about the way in which social media takes rumors, which already spread in a particular way, and intensifies the power of rumors to spread. But, and then seems to produce the truth because you have a visual, you have something there. Why would you not trust your eyes? If you don't trust your eyes, what else do you trust, right? But there's also the regional, I'm going to finish really in 2 minutes. There's also the playing a regional aspect. One is the playing out of partition politics. It's just messy. We're still doing, whether it's Burma or it's the Tripura Bangladesh border. There's that collective memories of partition are being mobilized by citizens constantly. And there is a real securitization of religion happening, particularly, I think, in Myanmar and India. So people actually see what is happening to Muslims in India. There is real Islamophobia, whether it's in Myanmar or in India or in a little bit in Sri Lanka. People read about those things. So at the same time that these stories circulate, there is no reason to believe them if they're going to circulate in that sphere, right? And all of this serves to deflect from actual problems, actual discontent, actual spaces to dissent are, so, if I probably couldn't do this talk in Bangladesh, and I've already left out lots of things, but, I don't want to, because there is so much surveillance too, right? So I think what we actually need is also a really transnational analysis, because I know when there were Buddhist temples destroyed in Bamu in the Chittagong hill tracts, a friend of mine in Sri Lanka told me, Malti Dalwis, who unfortunately passed away, told me that monks in Sri Lanka were already raising money, and these were the militant monks. I don't know the transnational circuits, but I think we really do need a transnational analysis, as well as an analysis that really focuses on social media. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Siddiqui, for bringing in this transnational angle. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was pretty straightforward with Modi, that you can't expect what happens in India to just stay at the borders of India.
Yeah.
And I remember also during Ayodhya, right? There were attacks against Hindus and Hindu mandirs in both Pakistan and Bangladesh. So this is, it's always been a transnational issue. The transnationality of it, they're different networks, right? So you have this extremist Buddhist network that's like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and southern Thailand, but you still have these networks operating with each other. So I just want to thank you for bringing in that level of that complex dimension. So Professor Vidisha Biswas, I am a big fan of your writings on this. And I think I told you, I put, because it's just so clear, it's so clear. And it was the meaning, I don't know, the amount of information per phoneme was just really profound. So if you want to talk, and I think Professor Siddiqui really opened up the path for you to talk about India.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think, the rise in majoritarian violence in India has been very, very well documented. So I'm going to assume that the audience here is familiar with those contours. So I'm going to sort of touch upon a few issues that I've been thinking about. And the first is really kind of developing from what Dina had said about majoritarianism and nationalism and this concept of exclusion as exclusionary politics. Because in India, when we talk about majoritarian violence, we automatically know that we're talking about violence inflicted by Hindus or violence inflicted in the name of Hindus on minority non-Hindu groups, right? And that kind of makes sense because Hindus are roughly 80% of India's population. But I actually want to go back and unpack and critique that understanding itself, right? Because majoritism is an ideology that assumes that there is a predefined group of people that are the majority, that are united by a certain identity, who have the right to dominate society. And if they need to use violence to assert that dominance, so be it. But this begs the question for me, who is the majority in India, right? And we can say, well, the majority is Hindu because the majority of the population is Hindu, but I would like to ask, who is a Hindu? Which is a question that Hindu nationalists say that they have an answer to, and I have paid attention to their argument, and I don't get it. All religions carry multiple identities within them. We heard that from Neil as well as Shandina, but Hinduism, perhaps, more than most religions, really has no central founder, no central doctrine, no single place of worship that is sacred above all else. It's deeply, deeply divided by caste. So what are we really talking about when we talk about the majority? So I think it's really important, particularly in the current political and social context, to just sort of challenge the idea of the Hindu majority and who that Hindu majority really represents, because it has never really been defined. Mm-hmm. And that brings me to the second point, which I think also kind of goes to topics of violence that Dina and Neil raised, which is the phenomenon of mob violence, right? Seemingly uncontrolled violence being undertaken by private citizens on other citizens. Now, mob violence has always been a feature of Indian society, right? This idea that there are certain people, because of their position in society, they have the right to punish others, right? That is not something that the current nationalist government has brought in. But what we have seen now is that the government is explicitly condoning and celebrating acts of mob violence in the interests of this so-called majoritarianism, and that the media is celebrating it. Now, when you put these 2 points together, this idea of majoritarianism and condoning and an acceptance of mob violence, then you're creating something that is internally extremely dangerous for the Indian state, right? Because as Dina said, nationalism, majoritarianism can only exist when there is an other, right? That opposition has to exist. And because we've never really defined satisfactorily what or who a Hindu is, that other becomes very, very important to hold on to. So the other includes Muslims, 200 million of them, but it also includes all kinds of people, right? Left-wing extremists, intellectuals, urban nationals, this, that, the other. Because if you take away those others, there's really nothing to hold this idea of Hindutva together, right? And then, Dina also talked about nationality as something that is constructed and imagined, and that's absolutely true, right? Every state is imagined. Now, India, as scholars have pointed out, when it was established as an independent democracy in 1947, was conceptualized as a state nation, meaning you have the Indian state, and within that state, you have multiple subnational identities, which had originally been defined through linguistic contours and has then evolved into other things as well. But now the vision that the BJP is bringing, I think, is a vision of a nation state, which means the first thing that comes is this muscular Hindu nation, which must then prevail over the Indian state. But if we kind of see these 2 things together, then we have to sort of recognize that there is no way except for violence to establish such a nation state, right? If you recognize the obvious reality that multiple subnational identities exist in the state that we know to be India, then we also have to recognize that this binary identity within the state, that you're either Hindu or not Hindu, simply cannot coexist with democracy. And here I have a little bit of a quibble with what Dina said, because I don't think India can be majoritarian in terms of being a Hindu state and be a democracy at the same time. It is simply impossible. And so if India is not a democracy, and it is not a state nation that is subsuming the different identities that live within it, then what is it, right? And this is a question, if I'm really honest, it's kept me up nights, because I think it's a very troubling and very scary question. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about interstate relations. That's something that Neil and Dina have spoken, I think, very eloquently too. And so what I'll just kind of say to that is put in a plug for one of my favorite novels, which is Shadow Lines by the author Amitabh Ghosh, where he talks exactly about how violence spreads across Pakistan and Bangladesh and India. And at one point in the book, he says, that we like to believe that when we cross the border, we're entering a different reality, that on that other side, there is another reality. But this is a mirage. lines, because you can't really divide on memory. You can't really divide something that is imagined. Now, I don't want to be too much of a post-positivist about this because it's outside my zone of comfort, and I do think there are, boundaries and borders in South Asia. But in a sense, the lines of South Asian countries, including Sri Lanka, are in some sense their shadows. We do respond to each other in almost visceral ways. And so given that those lines are shadows, and given that India is the largest country in the region in terms of population, I think there are consequences to India being consumed by violence that we cannot even dare imagine today, which is a scary thought. So I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vishwas. Of course, the comments that you made about India are really similar to some of the concerns being raised about the state of Israel, right? So there's a really natural comparison that seems to arise out of your comments. What were you going to say, Professor Vishwas?
No, I agree. Absolutely. Yeah.
So last but not least, Dr. Mohammed Taqi, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Fair, and the other esteemed panelists. I'll sort of comment quickly on what Dr. Biswas said, and the building of a nation state in South Asia. Since my area is Pakistan, we actually started off where Modi's India might be today. And that's an extremely dangerous experiment that we went on with. I want to put Pakistan's current situation into a bit of a historical perspective. Right now, as most of you all are aware, that Pakistan is going through a virtual implosion. State institutions are dysfunctional, judges fighting judges, generals at the other generals' throats, politicians bickering, and really the economic turmoil of this proportion has not been seen in a while. We stand at the brink of a disaster. But somehow our politicians in Pakistan and other people managed to slip in an escalation to the already existing blasphemy laws this January. Previously, as most of you know, that we have laws on the books which talk about the blasphemy and punishable by death, imprisonment, fines. This time around, they took it a level up. Historically, blasphemy against Prophet Muhammad was on the books, but now they expanded it to include blasphemy against his associates, his next of kin, which is a very, very broad category and highly disputed and debated ever since his own times. Who is a member of the Prophet's household, who is considered a Prophet's companion. And the way the law is sitting right now, just the statistical probability of that going against the Pakistan's Shia population is extremely strong. So that sort of tells you where the states and the politicians' priorities might be. We just saw in my hometown, Peshawar, last month, a student made a small joke on a paper that his teacher was supposed to correct about one of the so-called rightly guided four caliphs. Made a small comment, and somehow it got to the rest of the students and teenagers mostly. They went on a rampage against their own school, their own teachers. Two of the teachers, including a vice principal, had to hide and probably leave town. To put it in perspective, our experiment with the nation building in Pakistan went awry from day one. M.A. Jinnah, the founder of the country, he started off with a robust communal movement in the form of All India Muslim League. And once Pakistan it came into being, they went to work right away to actually codify the otherization of non-Muslims, and also eventually it culminated into otherization of the Muslims. During Jinnah's own lifetime, he enlisted hundreds of religious clerics from all shades of Islamic denominations. And in the end, when he came to Pakistan's first Constituent Assembly, he stood there and said, "You're free to go to your temples and your mosques, and the religion will not be the business of state." Well, you can't do that. You cannot really prepare for a communal entity, carve it out of the larger subcontinent, and then when it is achieved, you say, scratch that. From here on, we start out fresh. That did not happen. Within years of the first Constituent Assembly meeting, we framed a constitution in 1956, which was a unique experiment in which actually a majority was turned into minority and otherized. This constitution of Pakistan, but on political grounds, not on religious grounds. The East Pakistan, which is East Bengal and the present day Bangladesh, it was given what was called parity with the West Pakistan, in which four or five different ethno-national entities existed. So these unique experiments went on, but it also actually declared Pakistan as an Islamic Republic. These were the kernels over which Pakistan's Islamic identity was to be based, and our military eventually took it from there. And what they, one of the first military rulers, or the first military ruler, Field Marshal General Ayub Khan, what he did was he came up with this idea based on some of these previously existing notions of mixing an anti-Indian jingoism, a nebulous Islamic identity and ideology, and came up with Islamic national security state, even though personally secular in outlook, but backed by the United States in the Cold War, and almost funded by the United States at that time, mostly funded by the United States. He came up with this idea in which a supra-ethnic gel was to be developed for Pakistan. After coming into existence, Pakistan really did not want to be associated with the South Asian roots and history. And these leaders and the military junta, they came up with the idea of falling back upon an Islamic ideology instead of going for a federation, which Pakistan was. What it did was that it turned the communal politics of pre-partition era into a full-blown confessional state. But the idea was that this confessional state, where every citizen or majority of the citizens are Muslims, they are non-denominational Muslims. But the otherization continued, and eventually in 1973, when a new constitution was formulated, the country was declared not only Islamic Republic, but regulations were made in which the high officers could only go to the Muslims, the president, the prime minister. And within a year, they came up with what is called the Second Amendment to the Pakistani Constitution, in which, for the first time in perhaps judicial history, they legislated that a community which calls themselves Muslims, the Ahmadiyya community, were officially apostatized and declared kafir, infidels, in the constitution. And that is a strange experiment in that particular National Assembly. The left-oriented political parties were in numeric majority. Pakistan People's Party of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and National Army Party, both which was in the opposition, both signed off on that legislation. It was one of the most draconian legislations that could exist. But what it did was, over the years, this a cocktail of the Islamic ideology, laws on the books, and codifying this otherization into the into law paved the way for eventually the common man taking it upon themselves to not just rely on the blasphemy laws, but actually take the law in their own hands, go on to communal violence against individual and larger communities. The other thing that was happening alongside this was that the national security state, which was anti-Indian orientation and to an extent anti-Afghanistan as well, they utilized this idea, not just utilized, but actually put it into curriculum, starting with Ayub Khan, who created religious indoctrination, and a subject was introduced, which was called Islamiyat, essentially meaning Islamic studies, which was theoretically supposed to be a non-denominational curriculum of Islam, but it had a highly anti non-Muslim dose of ideology in there. And alongside that, Pakistan Army, I don't use the word military because Army has really been the major force behind all of the takeovers and interventions. They also utilized religious proxies, both to counter the ethno-national political leftist progressive political entities inside Pakistan, and to prosecute their foreign policy against India as force multipliers in multiple wars, and also against Afghanistan. The sum total of that eventually was that we had these religio-political groups, actual jihadist group, and semi-militant organizations, some of which are relatively new on the stage, agitating and militating against the smaller sections of the population. 98% of Pakistan is about 98% of Pakistan is Muslim, and maybe 1.5% Hindus, and a smaller minority is Christians. But somehow Islam remains in danger, and we continue to have these issues where. But the fundamental problem is that we have come to a situation where the politicians do not find it conducive to their politics, and are actually scared of standing up and call for reforming these laws. There actually is no call for repealing these laws or undoing these laws. The most you would see is introduction of private bills in the parliament asking to modify. Even the Human Rights Commission, which is a private volunteer entity, cannot call for repeal of these laws, because blasphemy laws over the years have been weaponized and given into the hands of the common people through indoctrination, through mass mobilization of jihadist organizations, jihadi entities, that is very difficult for politicians to stand up. And the prime example of that we saw in case of Salman Taseer, who was the governor of the most populous Punjab province and happened to be the owner of Daily Times paper, for which I wrote for 6 years. And all he was trying to do was defend a Christian lady who had been on death row on a frame charge of blasphemy. So I'll stop here, and probably we should open up for question and answer.
Hey, thank you guys for such lucid and even brief discussions. So we do have one question that I think pertains to all of you in one way or another, and that is specifically, what should the United States, since we're all based in U.S. institutions, how should the U.S. respond to this? And I think there are a couple of complications. One, the United States itself is going through a convulsion, and I don't think there's a nicer way of putting it, but white nationalist, Christian nationalist, majoritarian, with all the caveats that Professor Bishwas raised about who is the majority, right? So, and we've seen that many of the individuals that were behind this movement are now sitting in Congress on important committees, right? So there's not really been a national repudiation. It's just further entrenched these divisions. So from a moral point of view, the US is certainly, I think, in a weakened position. And then the other thing that you see is, Bangladesh doesn't get included to, a US hosted meeting on democracy, but Pakistan does, right? No matter what Israel or what India, for example, does, the US really just sees other issues, right? It's the Indian market, it's the Indian, the possibility of India being an important defense partner. So the question is, how should the US specifically, or Western countries, respond? And I think he also makes the very astute point that when they do respond, the usual response, and I would say I see this more coming out of India, is that it's a reflex, a recourse to race, calling Americans, colonists and imperialists, which isn't really a fair description of the U.S. relationship towards South Asia, right, in particular. So in an ideal world, what possibly could the U.S. do to mitigate these trends? And this is coming from Ravi Uttap. Should we just go in the same? Well, let's go in the reverse order. So Taki, Bishwas, Siddiqui, Devoda.
Well, I briefly alluded to what U.S. has done over the years for Pakistan. It has kept 3 military dictators, 10 years each, afloat. In the last instance, it went on with about $33 billion in the so-called coalition support funds and so on. So what the U.S. has done over the years, as far as Pakistan goes, is it has rewarded bad behavior. Back in the Cold War era, when Ayub Khan offered his services part of CETO and CENTO, he received U.S. weaponry and largesse. And what he does is he collects all of that, turns around, starts a covert war against India, gets a full-blown war at hand in 1965. So long and short is that the gravy trains should stop. Strings should be attached to some of the funding that these countries would receive eventually, or for that matter, in trade and commerce as well. Yes, India is a big market. Bangladesh is a emerging market. But if you put a value on your values, then you better put your money where your mouth is. And in Pakistan's case, it probably would be to stipulate certain things and bringing to light and highlighting certain things are also important. You hardly hear any high-level U.S. official actually talk about the issues. All we get is a certain mention in a certain human rights report every 2 years, every 1 year. These issues have to be brought up consistently, constantly, and forcefully. And also the Pakistani phenomenon is closely tied to its use of militants domestically and to prosecute the foreign policy. But unfortunately, what usually happens is that once the U.S. Does not have an immediate interest in that particular area, it turns around and leaves the floor open. Right now, there are negotiations between Pakistan and IMF going on. Pakistan desperately needs a bailout, and the U.S. has a certain role to play in that. I'm not saying that the two should be tied, but these are opportunities to have the conversation going.
Excellent. I mean, and to that point, for those of us who watch Pakistan closely, Pakistan has the same playbook, right? It gets an IMF package. It fails to honor its commitments. It usually bails at the penultimate payment. And basically Pakistan's monetized the fear of the West of Pakistan collapsing. So I'm really glad. And of course it was just taken off the gray list. What was it in the fall? And so that was obviously a harbinger of what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, we just don't know where did those people who just came off the gray list, where they are.
Right, I know. It should have been on the blacklist, right? But that's another empirical discussion. Professor Bishwas, and actually this question in particular, I think applies to India, but also if Professor Siddiqui could consider it. I'm not so sure about the Sri Lanka case. We see a lot of activity happening in response to very aggressive evangelical proselytization. And so it doesn't, to the point that Professor Siddiqui made about internationalism, I spent a lot of my time in the Punjab, and there is a lot of evangelical proselytization. And that also just animates this sense of who is our other. Well, our other, and I hear it all the time, our other is the Abrahamic faiths. That seems to be, so I was wondering if in your answer, because my fear is if the US starts raising these issues, it's with the evangelical proselytization and already the conspiracy theories about it being, prompted by the US state or what have you, it makes it even more difficult, I think, for the US going through this Christian majoritarian white nationalist movement to raise these issues credibly. So Professor Biswas?
Yeah, absolutely, Christine. I think you raise a really good point, and it kind of also goes back to the question posted in Q&A that India has certainly kind of taken this whole decolonizing the post-colonial world and kind of run with it in a direction that was perhaps not anticipated by the scholars who promoted such a perspective. So, whether it's Christian missionaries coming or whether it's the US, issuing any kind of statement about human rights concerns, India is kind of at that place where it's just immediately getting very defensive and, this is all racism and colonialism. So there's a feeding in there as well. Two things that I want to really quickly say is one, the US needs India in sort of the grand geopolitical terms. That's not going to change. I know that there are human rights activists that are very disappointed with the Biden administration's relative silence on what's happening in India, but that's just the way it is. And both sides know it. But I do think that India is hemorrhaging soft power right now globally, including in the United States. I mean, yes, RRR won an Oscar and made millions of dollars, but the fact remains that the catastrophe that is the Indian democracy and the Indian political and social scenario is something that is being widely covered. And I think, members of Congress see it. They're speaking about diaspora politics. Part of my research is on diaspora narratives and counter narratives to Hindutva. And I think certain members of Congress certainly are under a lot of pressure from the more progressive Indian diaspora to speak out against what's happening in India. So I think that awareness is going to cause downstream problems from India from a soft power point of view. And the final thing I want to say, this is more of a people to people thing, also something that I reflected on in my writings, is that, India and the United States are the world's two largest democracies, and both, as Christine pointed out, are not really serving as the best role models for that democracy model. But both of them, I think, are grappling with very similar issues. I mean, there's the religious nationalism, but there's also just how do you cultivate democracy in soils that are undemocratic, to kind of paraphrase Dr. Ambedkar. And in that sense, I think the journeys of these two countries are very comparable. And I think there's a lot that both sides can learn from the other's experiences and the other's mistakes. And that can be only of benefit if you sort of take time to understand each other's histories, politics, literature. And that's, outside of the world of formal geopolitics, I think that understanding is really important. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being even more explicit in that comparison. Professor Siddiqui, there you are.
Great. I'm here.
Yeah, your turn. What do you have to say to this question?
Well, let's see. Not a huge lot. I don't think we should assume the innocence of either the United States or any of the European powers when they do on the question of intervention. As the Pakistan case makes clear, I think I see in Bangladesh, for instance, the big donors will talk about, say, the killing, and I should be very careful here, of certain people, but not talk about other things. So if you have minority rights, LGBT rights, they're willing to take a stand. But if you talk about the Digital Security Act and people being disappeared, it's not convenient. So there's already a selectivity in the kinds of things that are raised. So I really, when I'm talking about, transnationalism, I'm not talking about US or Europeans. I think there could be a really interesting regional kind of analysis and dialogue that is separate from the older neo-colonial global relations of power. And I think the second thing is, it's really interesting thinking about how places, governments like the Indian government have weaponized and repurposed actually quite serious imperial anti-colonial rhetoric. That rhetoric was there, put in by scholars for a reason, because there were relations of inequality. We have to be a little bit careful. Yes, I know there can be conspiracy theories and our critiques can be appropriated, but we have to be careful not to be silenced just because we're worried about being appropriated. So I think I'll leave it at that.
So to your point, Professor Siddiqui, and also to Professor Taki, I'm reminded of the massive disappearances that Pakistan conducted early in the so-called GWAT. The US was perfectly happy with that.
Yes.
No problems whatsoever. And to your point, I think one of the Sheikh Hasina gets away with a lot because she appears to be hard on terrorism.
Yep.
So Modi, even though it creates other issues for India domestically, and I think that goes a long way also with the United States. I was given do you remember early in the GWAT, the US loved RAB because RAB protected the embassy.
Let's not forget. Yes.
Let's not forget, right? US loved RAB. RAB protected the embassy. And I have to say, I didn't really see the RAB, the RAB prescription or whatever we're calling it, coming, because I was like, when did we stop loving RAB? We were perfectly happy to have Bangladesh and Pakistan wrapping up people when it suited our purposes. I don't think we have the same kinds of cooperation on counterterrorism so explicitly in the other countries of South Asia. But thank you for reminding everyone that the US has been very culpable in these policies, particularly in Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Yeah, in Pakistan's case, one of the earliest, perhaps the earliest political disappearance was during Field Marshal Ayub Khan's time. It was Hassan Nasir, a member of the Communist Party of Pakistan, which had just been banned, and he was eventually killed in where the Lahore fort currently stands and part of that area. Similarly, the US weaponry was used to subdue the 1973 Baloch insurgency. F-14s and Cobra gunships borrowed from the Shah of Iran were used. Multiple disappearances over the years, including of the Islamists, extraordinary renditions, sort of a paper prisoner program that Musharraf and the US ran at that time.
And of course, you're Pashtun. So, I mean, the cynic and many of us watch this. Basically any dead Pashtun could be posthumously declared a terrorist, as basically this head for money, right? And I think that's kind of what we see happening with the PTM movement. Is Pashtuns are like, why are we the fodder for this pay for terrorist program, right? It's
absolutely
consequences of that have really been profound, and seeing Pashtuns who have. If you look at Pashtuns, for example, in their recruitment in the army, they're actually overrepresented relative to their population. They've always been part of this condominium with Punjabis, and to see Pashtuns so pervasively vilified it's not unheard of in Pakistan's history. But the number of Pashtuns who are dying and who are imprisoned, elected Pashtun politicians are incarcerated. It's and the US doesn't really say anything about this.
No, not at all. And as far as the Army's composition goes, your book speaks to that, and whether it is actually a melting pot or not. But over the years, the Pashtun who have been part of the Army, they have actually subscribed to the Army's vision rather than actually diversifying its vision. So I don't think that there is any question about that. Ayub Khan himself was an ethnic Pashtun. General Yahya Khan was a distant cousin of mine, but not an ethnic Pashtun. He was a Qizilbash mercenary. So yeah.
Your encyclopedic knowledge of these things never ceases to take my breath away. So finally, Professor Devoto, what are your thoughts on this? Given the compromised nature of US democracy and our own actions in South Asia, what meaningful policies? Because again, going back to the way in which the Sri Lankan state dealt with the Tamils, what can the US possibly do that's constructive in Sri Lanka?
One of the things that comes out with all the comments in reaction to this question is that the US is very selective in how it criticizes and what it supports. And in the process can come across also looking very hypocritical. What I would partly say is that just because of some of the problems the US faces domestically, I don't think that should deter the US from speaking out. And the reason I say that is because it matters a lot in these countries. It certainly matters more in the smaller countries, in countries like Sri Lanka. The US has enormous purchase in terms of how its comments get played out, within the country. And the reaction you see is actually not any different today than it's been historically. I mean, it's that, who are these predominantly white countries to come and tell us how we should run our affairs? They've been doing it for, centuries, and this is neo-colonialism in action and the like. But for especially minority communities, oftentimes they have very little choice. But because if you think of, the way things are played out in Sri Lanka, in the interviews that I've done over the last 20 years or so, it's been fascinating how people, minorities, Tamils, but also Muslims more recently, they want the US to speak out. And it's because they have little voice, especially, in a country where you have the monks and others, dominating politics. You have an opposition that is afraid to speak out against, especially the monks in Sri Lanka. Nobody wants to speak out against the monks in Sri Lanka, especially when they're at the forefront of advocating, violence or tolerating violence. Civil society was very afraid to speak out. So when the opposition doesn't speak out in parliament, you look to civil society. But when civil society is neutered, like they were, like it was when the Rajapaksas were in power, they start to look to the diplomatic corps. And so in that sense, I think it's vital that the US and other countries that do have influence speak out. And part of the reason that what they say is kind of heeded, or at least not, I mean, the advice is not taken, but there's a reaction. And the reason there's a reaction is because if you take a country like Sri Lanka, the vast majority of its exports go to the EU and the US. And so that can be leveraged. And so what I would suggest is that, simply because of problems within the US, that should not be used as an excuse to not, to speak out. But in the process, I think it's important for the US to be humble and to kind of, acknowledge that, we're not doing this from with a superiority mindset, but we understand that we ourselves have issues within our societies and kind of, alter that narrative a bit.
Interesting. So we have another question. Now, I don't agree with this question, but it is a version of a narrative that I think we've all heard before from persons who want to diminish the communalization of India and the really genuine, empirically verifiable Islamophobia that does exist in India. But this person is raising the argument that you don't see so many mosques destroyed in India. So these arguments about Islamophobia can't be true. Let me first say to this individual, you might want to look at the Suchar Committee report. Suchar Committee report looks at an array of discrimination that Muslims face. If you want to denounce the Suchar Committee report as I'm just anticipating the arguments that I've heard in response to Suchar is, oh, that was a Congress ploy at appeasement of vote bank politics. Okay, so let's say that you are resistant to the data in the Suchar Committee report. Why don't you take a look at India's own census returns, right? Muslims, and of course there's great variation across states naturally, but on average, Muslims are come up on human development indicators that are usually, I shouldn't say usually, depending upon the state, often below that of scheduled castes and OBCs, right? So you can reduce Suchar if you want, but how do you dismiss out of hand Indian census data that have been collected for a very long time? Do any of you want to take on this question of just reducing Islamophobia to the destruction of mosques?
I don't know, Bidisha, do you want to say something? I have just a couple of things to say. very quickly. I don't know if you follow things like the Love Jihad campaigns, for instance, or the ways in which little 15-year-old boys can be pulled off trains and lynched to death, and those videos circulated, and the kind of way in which the state then provides support, as Vidisha was pointing to. These are very well-known facts. We don't need to, I mean, this is, as Christine was saying, these are empirical realities. It's kind of hard to reduce that. You may not call it Islamophobia, but it's certainly, there is a desire to eliminate the Muslim in some kind of sense from Indian, what counts as Indian culture, including changing the names of streets, including some people claiming a Muslim didn't build the Taj Mahal. I could go on, but I don't, yeah, I mean, that's all.
Yeah,
There are many examples.
probably we could have a whole discussion about
Yes,
this. It would last
indeed.
hours.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you raised this issue of love jihad, because
Yeah.
this is where the Hindu
Yeah.
majoritarians, as well as the Buddhist majoritarians, really overlap.
Yes.
There, and when I read the discourse on love jihad, the hypersexualization of the male Muslim body reminds me a lot of what white supremacists have done to the Black male body, and
Yeah.
about controlling access to, quote, our women sexually. They've got no problems, right? When the reverse happens, right? When a Hindu man gets a Muslim woman and she raises their children as Hindu, they're completely okay with that in a way that's not so dissimilar to when white men have relations with Black women. Boy, a Black man has access to a white woman, and people literally get killed over that. Professor Bishwas, I can't wait to hear what you have to say in response to this question.
Well, I mean, I agree with everything that you and Dina said. I would just, in response to Mr. Chaturvedi's question, say that animosity towards a religion is about a lot more than destroying places of worship. And as you said, Christine, there is ample evidence to show that animosity towards Muslims in India is increasing. But I also just want to say once again that if we are talking about a Hindu nation, right, that is centering the Hindu faith, then it's not just a matter of destroying or not destroying mosques. I think it's a matter of how you are looking to understand the multiple identities and groups that live inside India. And I think we are, we all I'm from India. I want to think well of India, but I think we're fooling ourselves if we're saying there is not a serious internal problem. And as in one's households and families, to say, well, that family has problems isn't a solution to your own family's problem. So what is happening or not happening in Bangladesh and Pakistan? Yes, there are these shadow lines that are happening in all these countries and in Sri Lanka, but I think each country also has agency and must take responsibility for what's happening within its borders, and what's happening within India's borders cannot be described as anything other than deeply exclusionary and non-democratic. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you. On this issue for everyone here, I've recently been doing a deep dive into Savarkar. And I strongly encourage anyone who doubts the violent, the structurally violent motivation, but behind Hindutva politics, to re-engage Savarkar, or even if you can find his treatise on Hindutva. It's available for free. You don't even have to buy it. But Dr. Taki, I have to tell you, I really thought of you, and I was really engaging Savarkar. The argument it makes is identical to the argument that Lashkar-e-Taiba makes. Lashkar-e-Taiba makes the argument that we have to keep engaging jihad because that's the only way we reestablish the caliphate. And if we stop, that's why the caliphate was destroyed in the first place. Savarkar makes the exact same argument that what he calls Sindhustan, with the aspirate, so he's not drawing from the Perso-Arabic tradition of Stan. He makes the exact same argument that Indians, who he defines as Sindhustanis, which starts from a geographical point of reference, can only reestablish Sindhustan from a Dharam Yud. The arguments are so strikingly similar. And I haven't had access to Islamic State materials, But Lashkar makes that argument. And I was wondering, Dr. Taki, are you aware of Islamic State? Because you'll notice the geography, like they both have really similar capacious. The most aggressive Akhund Bharat maps include much of Central Asia. It includes Thailand, it includes Cambodia, Indonesia, and elsewhere. They're creating a sort of a geographic claim that never existed. It
Right,
should
right.
be said. So I'm wondering, Dr. Taki, could you speak to this issue with Islamic State?
I can't speak specifically to the Islamic State, but broadly speaking, the revivalist movements in the subcontinent, whether they are Muslim revivalist movements or Hindu revivalist movement, they date back to 1850s, 1860s. Deoband was founded in 1867. The rise of the Barelvi movement in UP also is right around that time. And alongside that, you also have the Hindu revivalist movement, some of which basically inspired Savarkar Shuddhi, which is the purification movement, or Sancton unification movement. Not a whole lot different than the Ghar Wapsi type phenomenon that we are talking about. And geographical claims, denial of history. I heard somebody in a podcast today on a Indian news network that Tipu Sultan was not fighting the British to seek freedom. He was doing this, that, and the other thing. So rewriting history in real time is classically revisionist of the revivalist movements. And what you have is a modern version of those revivalist movements. And what I was going to say about this question, that whether the empiric evidence suggests that this many mosques have been burnt or not, give it some time and you would have enough of genocidal levels. What I alluded to was the 1956 Constitution of Pakistan, which decided to otherize a ethno-national entity, the Bengalis, and in less than 25 years, we had a genocide there. Same thing goes for otherization of the Muslim entities within Pakistan. Both the Shia, which are officially not declared kafir or infidels, but are treated quite shabbily in many ways, or for that matter, the Ahmadiyya. So how the words are chosen, how the narrative is framed, and how it is eventually codified would dictate the results. And unfortunately, India's trajectory is precarious to close to Pakistan's, maybe 70 years late, but very fast and furious.
Yeah. Professor Devoda, do you have any thoughts about this issue?
Yeah.
In the Sri Lankan case? Or?
In response to that question, is that if you just ask yourself to what extent can a particular community commit violence or undermine the rule of law and do so with impunity, I think that is a simple enough standard for a dispassionate observer to decide whether what you're seeing in a country privileges a particular minority, whether you're seeing a majority, privileges a particular majority, or if you're seeing a minority being marginalized and the like. And what we have seen in Sri Lanka, what we've seen in India, is that if you are associated with the majority party, if you are a support of the majoritarian ideology, Hindutva, or what I would call Sinhalatva, if you can do almost anything and get away with it, and what you have then is a breakdown in the rule of law, and if you just focus on that, you don't have to focus on the destruction, as Videshwa said, of mosques or temples or churches. I think that's a simple enough kind of test for somebody who's dispassionate.
So, Professor Devoda, you touched on something that I think is really interesting. Obliquely, you touched upon it, and that is the role of the police, right? So often when we have had these scourges, I think about the 1984 anti-Sikh riots, right? That involved the apparatus of the state. The anti-Muslim pogroms in Mumbai involve the apparatus of the state. When you see Muslims getting beaten up in India, you'll often see the police right there. And boy, we see it in Pakistan all the time, right? The police themselves have become agents of going after Ahmadis, right? So, you know, the police are one of the most basic ways in which citizens interact with the state. And when the state has an institution like the police that are actually part of the I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, the apparatus of violence, what is your recourse as a citizen? You know, it puts the citizen in a really tough place. You know, how many of the cow lynchers have ever seen a moment of jail? I mean, it's like the state itself is an active participant in the alienation of these ethnic as well as religious minorities. In the same way, again, there's a lot of similarities to the United States, right? These similarities, you know, I am constantly recognizing these connections of the involvement of American police institutions in buttressing white supremacy, even when you have Black cops engaging in the violence, right? I think one of you made this point of how even minorities can be co-opted into the system because it proves to be a beneficial strategy, right? To be the enforcer of the majoritarian. There's a question I think is particularly relevant to your work, Professor Biswas, as well as your work, Professor Devoda, and that's about diasporas. So I did my dissertation on the Sikh diaspora and the Khalistan movement. Diasporas have always played an important role with the Tamils. So I was wondering if the two of you in particular could take Ravi Uthap's question about the roles of diasporas.
Sure, Neil, do you want to go first?
Yeah, one of the things that fascinates me with diasporas, and I'm especially familiar with that, and I can speak here to the Tamil diaspora, especially in Canada and in the UK, is that in some ways they seem to be more nationalist than, you know, the ethnic group in the home country. And I find that to be a very selfish position because, you know, here are these folks, you know, ensconced in these host societies, living, you know, a fairly decent life, who can afford actually to take extremist positions that endangers the well-being of, you know, their ethnic in their home societies. And that has always upset me, and I've something I keep bringing up with some of these folks. And of course, they portray their position as a love for nation, and they point to the atrocities that are being committed against the nation and how they are more free to speak out as opposed to their, you know, cousins and brethren in the home country. But also with regard to the security forces, I think one of the worst things that can happen is militarization. And in the Sri Lankan case, militarization has led to a situation, and this is also true in places like the Punjab and elsewhere, that the security forces get aligned with the interests of the state. And then you combine corruption. I mean, in Sri Lanka, I think 94 to 96% of all the members of the security forces belong to the majority community. We don't have real numbers. That's a guess. That's a guess based on speaking to various people in government itself. And so it's not a good situation to be a minority in that context. And so I don't want to move away from the diaspora angle, but I thought I'd mention that because you started out speaking about kind of, you know, the indiscipline of the police and how that contributes to violence against minorities.
Professor Biswas?
Yes, I love this topic. I study it a lot. And, you know, in addition to everything that Neil said, I'd just like to say that the Indian diaspora, of course, is very, very large in the US, in the UK. And while it has been an enthusiastic supporter of Hindu nationalism in India, I also do believe, and my research does show, that some of that support has been overblown. I think that the diaspora community reflects India's many diversities, and there have been quite a few voices that have spoken out against rising majoritarian violence in the country. I live in Seattle, and Seattle, just before COVID hit in February 2020, passed a resolution. It was a symbolic resolution, but it was a resolution that condemned what was happening in India, and in particular the Citizenship Amendment Act, and explicitly called upon the US Congress to address what is happening in that country. So, I mean, all that to say that I do think diasporas are very influential. They have a love of the homeland, which is what it is. But the kinds of the contours of influence that they have is, I think, much more nuanced than we sometimes understand it to be. Thank you.
So on this point, I'm thinking of the Tamils, and I'm thinking about the Sikhs. We have to also differentiate different kinds of diasporas, right? There are the diasporas of the economic migrant. They're just leaving because they have the opportunity, right? And they have relatively high human capital at home, which is what enables them to come here and be so successful. But in the case of, the Tamil diasporas, when I looked at quite a bit a number of years ago, there were different waves of Tamil diasporas, but the conflict diaspora, specifically the Tamils that were fleeing the anti-Tamil steps of the state that became increasingly violent. That is a very different diaspora than the previous diasporan Sri Lankan Tamils that were purely economic migrants. And you see the same thing with the Sikh diaspora, right? You have this earlier Sikh diaspora that we saw that really goes back to the 19th century, that starts on the West Coast, right, in Vancouver, and goes all the way down to the Imperial Valley in California. But then you have this very particular Jat Sikh conflict diaspora that really fled following 1984. And so not only, so to get to this question, we have to problematize the Indian diaspora. How is that different from, say, Gujarati diasporas or Bengali diasporas? Because that's how it used to be, right? We used to talk about specific Indian diasporas. And then within those communities of diaspora, are they economic migrants? Are they conflict migrants? So diaspora politics is really interesting for that reason, is that it is just so, it's really difficult to get if you only view it as a diaspora, it's difficult to really understand the dynamics of what's going on with a community. I'm wondering if Professor Siddiqui, as an outsider, I watch Bangladeshi diaspora politics, and it's kind of like a clone of what I see. You're either when I interact with my dentists or my doctors, are you Awami League or are you with BNP? And damn it, they've got firm answers, even though they've been living in this country for decades.
It's really interesting, and you're absolutely right. What they've done is they've taken the conflict with them, the bipolar division of the world, and the cultural, political, religious worlds have just been plopped on and imposed. I mean, I live in New York, very close to Queens and the Bronx, where there are large Bangladeshi populations. And especially among the older population, I will say, because this is actually changing, but the divisions on, whether it's a cultural issue or religious ceremony like Eid, or whether you're just going to celebrate Mother Language Day, International Mother Language Day, there are always two sides, right? And sometimes I once gave I was on a panel somewhere at a university talking to a Bangladeshi student club, but then these people from both sides, either side of the aisle, showed up and made things very difficult for those of us who just wanted to analyze things. That is changing. So it's not a relationship with the homeland. It's having the kind of cultural capital that you have if you can ally yourself with the Awami League or with the BNP. So it's very much about how to make one's space or one's place in the diaspora. And in the younger generation, it's really changing.
Oh,
They are
interesting.
invested, at least in New York, they're really invested in local politics. They are actually allying with the African American populations, are talking about policing, right?
Mm,
It's a
mhm.
very different thing. But it's very new that's happening. But you're right. I mean, cloning is a great term because that's what it is. They're not necessarily intervening.
Right.
In the same way that the Tamil diaspora was raising money, or the Indians seem to be always raising money, or, you know, the Hindu, whatever council it was, I know, 20 years ago.
VHP.
Yes, raised enormous sums of money. That does not happen.
Mhm. So, Dr. Taki, member of the Pakistan diaspora yourself, how do you see the diaspora operating domestically and also with relationship to what's happening in Pakistan?
So Pakistani diaspora in the US is, I would say, a bit behind the Indian diaspora in their political integration in the United States. That is probably one thing that stands out. It's a relative microcosm of the Pakistani demographic back home. And also represents a particular class interests. Especially, I see that in doctors, middle class professionals, reflecting more vocal jingoistic nationalism, right wing type ideology that Imran Khan, for example, champions. Just recently they wrote to the U.S. Congress, and a whole bunch of doctors signed on to it. They're definitely not the majority in the doctors, but a vocal one, and savvy at utilizing social media, making their presence known. On the other hand, if you go to working class Pakistani diaspora in New York or DC, you would find different varieties and shades of the Pakistani demography represented there. But since they don't capture the social media platforms the way middle classes are using, they tend to get ignored, perhaps written off. So that's what I've noticed mostly in the present Pakistani diaspora situation. But as the other panelists have said, I think things are changing. The second generation Pakistani origin kids, my own girls included, they're very deeply allied with the social and political issues within the United States. My younger daughter took me to a BLM march in Gainesville, Florida. So, you know, we are on it.
Yeah, so the one, just as a casual observer, so I think maybe Dina and I were kind of the same age. The one thing I've observed over time, and particularly just watching the US government looking at congressional staffers, you see so much more South Asian presence in the apparatus of the US government. And I mean that across the board, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I think I first started coming to DC as a South Asianist, it would be really unusual to find a South Asian in any of these offices. And increasingly they are. And I think that also speaks to some of the, I know I've never seen hard data on it, by the way. I don't even know if we collect such data, but from visual inspection over the last 30 years, you're just so much more likely to see a South Asian participating in the apparatus of government, elected office, right? So there are some communities in North America, like the Sikhs, of course, have a long history of participating and getting elected to, for example, Canadian politics. That sort of speaks to the age and the positionality of that diaspora. But I just see it also at the state level. You see much more South Asian engagement. And the fact that we now have 2 South Asian contenders for the GOP presidential ticket. Like, who would have seen that 20 years ago? And then that we have Kamala Harris, who is of mixed heritage, in the vice president. I mean, this is, I think these are really important mile markers that we probably should just take a moment to appreciate. I might not like their politics, by the way, but I think it's important that we have a daughter of a turban wearing Sikh even though she doesn't identify as a Sikh. And I forget the other fellow's name, who's also running on the Republican ticket.
Oh yeah,
Do-
Rama something.
Yeah, he's positioning himself very much along the lines. I saw some of his tweets about getting rid of affirmative action, really focusing on merit culture. And the only thing that came up to me, I know for those of you who don't appreciate Dave Chappelle, but I'm talking about Dave Chappelle 1.0. He has this brilliant sketch of a blind Black Klansman who doesn't know he's Black, but he's a Klansman. And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is right out of Dave Chappelle 1.0. But, and on a humorous note. So we are well past 5:30. I want to thank all of you. I can't wait to hopefully see you at a conference someplace in person. And thanks to all of the folks who have stuck around well past the initial posted time for this event. I'm really indebted to all of you. All right, thank you guys. Have a great day.